The year is 1974, and Ed Roberts, the founder of a calculator company called MITS, is in a pickle. His calculator company is not selling any calculators. So Roberts decides to stop making calculators, which are boring pieces of junk, and starts developing the first personal computer, a kit. Thus, the Altair 8800 is born, which also is a boring piece of junk. No keyboard, no screen, and no operating system. To input data into the computer, you had to use a bunch load of switches, and it was done directly in binary code. Disgusting! Nonetheless, it was a success. 250 orders per day in the first month. The nerds were rising and forming computer clubs. The commotion was such that in January 1975, an article was published about the Altair 8800 in the tech magazine Popular Electronics. And this got the attention of two specially dedicated nerds, Bill Gates and Paul Allen, the founders of Microsoft. They decided to create software for the Altair computer. So they did. And it worked, so they sold it to Ed Roberts, the calculator man. The software was called Altair Basic, and for each copy sold with an Altair computer, Allen and Gates would get a royalty of $30 to $60, which roughly equates to $142 and $285 today. Microsoft was ready to make a ton load of money, but it didn't. While the Altair computer was selling in the thousands, the Altair Basic software was only selling in the low hundreds. And that is kind of weird, isn't it? I mean, a computer needs software, and the one created by Microsoft was pretty awesome. So why in the hell wasn't the software selling more? Well, the problem here was a simple one. People had to buy the computer. No choice there. But the software? Well, the software is just information. Data converted to binary, and it wasn't very difficult to copy the ones and zeros. Only 10% of people using Altair Basic had bought it. The rest of the nerds from the computer clubs were using copies. Bill Gates was not happy. He worked hard to make the software work. Nevertheless, there's nothing he could do. Software is like a funny joke. Once you tell it to someone, you can't control if that someone tells the joke to other people or not. But Gates had an idea. He decided to shame the thieves, and for that he wrote a letter and sent it to every tech publisher in the USA. And this is the famous letter from Bill Gates to the hobbyists. The letter basically condemns everyone copying Microsoft's software. One could say that this was the beginning of piracy and the long war between software developers and software crackers. To be a cracker, you need a crack. So you can crack the software. Even more important, you need to know what cracking actually means. Cracking a software is by definition the modification of software to remove or disable features which are considered undesirable. In the case of the Altair Basic, the undesirable feature was the quantity. So cracking it was as simple as copying it to another storage unit. And I say it was simple because the storage unit used at the time was punched tape. Yep, you heard me right. To store software, they used tape with holes in it, in which the presence or absence of holes defined the binary bits. The tape had normally 8 rows, which means that each line stored 8 bits or a byte of information. If it were possible to store a game like Call of Duty Black Ops 3 in this format, it would take about 122,000 kilometers or 76,000 miles of tape to do it. You could basically wrap the planet Earth with Black Ops 3 and still have enough tape to make a pretty bow. And that is just amazing if you ask me. The nerds had it good for a while. If your cousin had the software, you also had the software. But the good times were about to end. Enters the floppy disk.
Before being recognized as the safe icon, floppy disks were a common storage media for software, and even though it was pretty easy to copy them in normal circumstances, it allowed complex disk-based software copy protection. A floppy disk works in a basic level, not unlike punched tape, but instead of tape we have disk, and instead of holes we have magnetic markers. They were usually divided in tracks, and each track was divided in sectors. The data was read and written by a magnetic head, and to facilitate positioning, most floppy disks had an index hole, so the driver would know exactly where the disk was, rotation-wise. The standard was to have a separate device to read the floppy disk, called driver, that would read and store the data.
Standard is a very important word in this case. Because if all floppy disk drivers follow the norms, it would be really easy to copy them. But there was a computer company that is known for not liking standard.
The first software copy protection was applied to the software for the Apple II. This computer didn't have a separate device to read and write a floppy disk. The driver head was controlled directly by the CPU and didn't use the index hole at all. To head into the mixture, the Apple II didn't read the data in bytes like most computers. Instead, analyzed the floppy disk by its raw data in nibbles.
This posed a major threat to all software crackers. But just like Don Astrid said,
I guarantee that whatever scheme you come up with will take less time to break than to think of it. Thus was created the locksmith, the first bit nibbler. Capable of reading floppy disks on a bit level, this software completely destroyed all of Apple's defenses, because it didn't have to interpret the data to copy it.
As you can imagine, this competition between developers and crackers escalated really quickly, and sure enough, companies started developing really creative copy protection mechanisms. Good examples of this appeared in the video game industry, where some of the ideas would actually increase in a fun way the game experience, while others were just plain silly.
The most common method was requiring the player to enter a specific word from the manual of the game. If you didn't have the manual, you couldn't play the game. This happened in games like Ski or Die, 4D Sports Boxing, and James Bond 007, The Stealth Affair. Sometimes the manual would also contain vital hints for the completion of the game, like answers to riddles, recipes for spells, and keys to deciphering non-Latin writing systems. In Metal Gear Solid, the player had to use specific radio frequencies supplied by the developers to communicate with other characters.
Unfortunately, not all copy protection strategies were fun and creative.
The lens lock system used a plastic prismatic device shipped with the game, which was used to descramble the code displayed on screen. It would be just fine if it worked, but the problem is not all TVs are the same size, so customers would many times end up not being able to play a game they bought.
Even though most of these techniques were enjoyable, they lacked effectiveness, because if you could copy the game, in most cases you could also copy the manual and all the necessary information to play the game. This is a fundamental and inevitable weakness of copy protection schemes, and it's called the analog hole.
If you can watch a movie, you can also record it in your phone. If you can read a book, even by hand it's possible to copy the whole thing. As soon as digital information is converted to analog data, it's possible to copy it.
It almost seems like the only way to prevent people from copying software is by having direct access to their computer. If only companies had access to an interconnected network of computers, so they could check the legality of each game independently.
Fast forward to the 90s, a decade full of yo-yos, Tamagotchis, and the internet.
Thanks to the internet, video game companies no longer had to develop gimmicky strategies to prevent people from copying their software. They could simply force people to activate the games online. They could also limit the number of installations and the number of computers in which the software was installed in. It was the best of solutions. Finally, piracy was over, and everybody bought their software. The end. Nah, just kidding. Shit just got really worse.
The internet brought more problems than solutions. Because in the old days, if someone cracked the software, they had to copy it to physical storage units, which were relatively expensive at the time, and then send them to everyone they knew.
The internet was a game changer. It took just one person to crack the software. After that, that person could share the software not only with their ugly cousin, but also with the whole world.
Now, if it seems odd to you how a handful of nerds can so easily beat copy protection systems developed by tons of engineers who work for multi-millionaire corporations, is because it is.
But it's also because that is not the actual picture. As soon as the first software were released in the market, a movement began to develop. A lot of smart people started cracking every software they could get their hands in. Not necessarily because they needed it. Not for money, not for fame, but because they took it as a challenge. A puzzle that needed solving. For them, cracking a video game was the actual game. It didn't take much time until isolated crackers joined their efforts, thus giving birth to an underground and international group called the Juarez scene. The scene has no central leadership, no location, nor other organizational conventions, but they do have rules. To release the cracked version of any product, they must follow a set of rules that guarantees the final quality. If these conditions are not met, the cracked goods are nuked. Cracking has been the core element of the scene since its beginning. They specialize in the creation of software cracks and key generators. The challenge of cracking and reverse engineering complicated software is what makes it an attraction for them. Cracking a software is a fun way of learning a lot about programming, encryption, reverse engineering, and puzzle solving. But never forget that it takes a lot of money, time, and dedication to develop a software. So don't forget to support the developers. This will be everything for today. I hope you enjoyed the video. And if you did, please consider subscribing. Until the next time,
Bye bye.
the nerds had it good for a while. If you had the rapatapata. Standard is a very important.
NANI?
As you can imagine, this